Marcus Romano had always been the kind of person who disappeared into crowds. At 28, he worked as a delivery driver for a small family restaurant in Chicago's Little Italy, navigating the narrow streets with boxes of steaming pasta and crispy pizza. His beat-up Honda Civic had seen better days, but it got him from point A to point B, which was all that mattered to someone living paycheck to paycheck. Every morning, Marcus would wake up in his cramped studio apartment above Mrs. Antonelli's bakery, shower in the tiny bathroom where the pipes groaned like old bones, and head downstairs to grab a coffee and pastry before starting his shift. Mrs. Antonelli, a 70-year-old Italian woman with flour permanently embedded under her fingernails, had taken a liking to Marcus. She would slip him extra cannoli or a warm loaf of bread, always with a smile that reminded him of his grandmother. The neighborhood had character, but it also had rules. Everyone knew that certain blocks belonged to certain people, and those people didn't appreciate outsiders asking too many questions. Marcus had learned early on to keep his head down, deliver his orders, and mind his own business. He had no family left after his parents died in a car accident 5 years earlier, leaving him with nothing but debt and a fierce determination to survive. On this particular Tuesday morning in September, Marcus was running behind schedule. The restaurant's morning prep cook had called in sick, leaving the kitchen scrambled and orders backing up. By the time Marcus loaded his car with the lunch deliveries, he was already 30 minutes late. He knew that meant smaller tips and possibly some angry customers, but there wasn't much he could do about it. His first stop was always the Riverside Medical Center, where Dr. Elena Vasquez worked as a trauma surgeon. Marcus had been delivering lunch to the hospital staff for almost 2 years, and Dr. Vasquez always ordered the same thing: chicken parmigiana with a side salad and a Diet Coke. She was different from his other customers, always taking a moment to ask how his day was going, treating him like an actual person instead of just the delivery guy. Elena was 32, with dark hair always pulled back in a practical ponytail and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to see everything. She had grown up in a working-class Mexican family in Chicago's Pilsen neighborhood, fighting her way through medical school with scholarships and student loans that would take decades to pay off. Her colleagues respected her skill in the operating room, but Elena often felt like she was walking a tightrope between two worlds: the privileged environment of the hospital and the neighborhood where she grew up. That Tuesday, when Marcus arrived at the hospital, Elena was just finishing a particularly difficult surgery. A construction worker had fallen from scaffolding, and she had spent 4 hours repairing internal injuries that could have easily been fatal. Her scrubs were wrinkled, her feet ached, and she was looking forward to 10 minutes of quiet with her lunch. When Marcus knocked on her office door, Elena looked up from the medical charts scattered across her desk and smiled. There was something different about him today, she noticed. Usually, Marcus seemed rushed, always checking his watch and thinking about the next delivery. Today, he lingered for a moment, and she caught him looking at the framed photo on her desk of her family at her younger brother's graduation. "Big family?" Marcus asked, setting her lunch on the small table by the window. "4 siblings," Elena replied, opening the container of chicken parmigiana. "You?" "Just me now," Marcus said quietly, and Elena heard something in his voice that made her look up. She had spent enough time reading people's faces in emergency situations to recognize grief when she saw it. "I'm sorry," she said simply, and Marcus was surprised by how much those 2 words meant coming from her. They talked for a few more minutes about nothing important: the weather, the construction on Michigan Avenue, the new coffee shop that had opened down the street from the hospital. But for Marcus, it was the first real conversation he'd had with someone in weeks. Most of his interactions were transactional, quick exchanges of money for food with people who barely looked at him. As Marcus was leaving, Elena did something she had never done before. She left him a $20 tip on a $12 order. When Marcus tried to give her change, she waved him away. "You made my day better," she said. "Thank you." Marcus left the hospital feeling lighter than he had in months. He didn't notice the black sedan that had been parked across the street, or the man sitting behind the wheel who had been watching the entire exchange. Vincent "Vinny" Torino was the kind of man who commanded attention without asking for it. At 45, he had the kind of presence that made room conversations pause when he entered. His hair was silver at the temples, perfectly styled even at noon on a Tuesday. His suits were custom-tailored, his shoes Italian leather, and his watch cost more than most people made in a year. Vinny had been born into the life. His father had been a soldier in the Torino crime family, and his grandfather before that. He had inherited not just the family business, but the family expectations. By the time he was 25, Vinny had proven himself ruthless enough to earn respect and smart enough to avoid the mistakes that had put many of his contemporaries in prison or the ground. The Torino family controlled a significant portion of Chicago's South Side, with interests in construction, waste management, and several restaurants that served as fronts for their other activities. Vinny had modernized many of their operations, bringing them into the 21st century, while maintaining the old-school loyalty and discipline that had kept the family strong for 3 generations. But success had come with isolation. Vinny's world was filled with people who wanted something from him, soldiers looking for advancement, business partners seeking favor, law enforcement trying to build cases. Genuine human connection was a luxury he couldn't afford. And after 2 failed marriages to women who ultimately couldn't handle the reality of his life, Vinny had resigned himself to a certain kind of loneliness. That changed 6 months ago when he met Dr. Elena Vasquez. Vinny had been brought to Riverside Medical Center after a business meeting went wrong and he caught a bullet in the shoulder. It was nothing serious, more of a graze than anything else, but his lawyer insisted he get proper medical attention to avoid any complications. Elena had been the surgeon on duty that night, and she had treated Vinny with the same professional competence she showed every patient, regardless of who they might be or what they might have done. There had been something about her that caught Vinny's attention immediately. She wasn't intimidated by him, which was unusual. Most people, once they figured out who he was, either became overly nervous or tried too hard to impress him. Elena simply did her job, stitching up his shoulder while making small talk about the Cubs' chances in the playoffs. Vinny started finding excuses to return to the hospital, a checkup that could have been handled by any doctor, bringing flowers to the nursing staff to thank them for their care, donating money to the hospital's trauma center. Each visit was an opportunity to see Elena, to have a few minutes of conversation with someone who treated him like a person instead of a reputation. He began sending her gifts, expensive flowers, bottles of wine, jewelry that she always politely refused. Vinny was used to getting what he wanted, and Elena's consistent rejections only made her more intriguing. She was professional but firm, always redirecting their conversations back to medical matters or general pleasantries. Elena, for her part, was well aware of who Vincent Torino was. You didn't grow up in Chicago without hearing stories about the Torino family. She had treated enough victims of gang violence to know what men like Vinny were capable of, and she wanted no part of that world. But Vinny was persistent in a way that was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. On this particular Tuesday, Vinny had been sitting in his car outside the hospital, waiting to catch a glimpse of Elena during her lunch break. He had been doing this more frequently lately, telling himself he was just hoping for a casual encounter, a chance to talk to her without the clinical atmosphere of the hospital. When he saw the delivery driver enter the building and then spend an unusually long time in Elena's office, Vinny felt something he hadn't experienced in years: jealousy. Not the business-related competitiveness that drove most of his decisions, but something more personal and primitive. Through the window, he could see Elena laughing at something the delivery driver said. When the young man left, Elena was smiling in a way that Vinny had never seen during their interactions. It was genuine and unguarded, the kind of expression that suggested real affection rather than polite professionalism. Vinny had his driver follow Marcus's Honda Civic as it made its remaining deliveries that afternoon. He learned that the kid worked for Russo's family restaurant, lived alone above a bakery, and had no obvious connections to anyone important. He was nobody, which somehow made Vinny's jealousy burn hotter. That evening, Vinny called a meeting with his inner circle at the back room of Torino's, the restaurant that served as his unofficial headquarters. The room was windowless, with dark wood paneling and a table that had hosted thousands of conversations that would never be repeated outside those walls. Tommy Marconi, Vinny's lieutenant and childhood friend, could tell something was bothering his boss. Vinny was usually focused during these meetings, running through business efficiently and making decisions quickly. Tonight, he seemed distracted, checking his phone repeatedly and drumming his fingers on the table. "You okay, boss?" Tommy asked after they had finished discussing the week's collections from their various enterprises. Vinny was quiet for a long moment, considering how much to say. Tommy had been with him for 20 years, had saved his life more than once, and was one of the few people Vinny trusted completely. But this felt different, more personal than the usual business they discussed. "There's a girl," Vinny said finally, and Tommy raised an eyebrow. It wasn't like Vinny to discuss his personal life, even with his closest associates. "Someone special?" Tommy asked carefully. "She's a doctor at Riverside Medical. Smart, beautiful, independent." Vinny paused. "She won't give me the time of day." Tommy almost smiled at that. He had seen plenty of women throw themselves at Vinny over the years, attracted to his power and money. The idea that someone was immune to his boss's charm was both surprising and somehow refreshing. "Maybe she's just not interested in getting involved with someone in our line of work," Tommy suggested. "Lot of women feel that way." "It's not that," Vinny said, his voice hardening. "There's some delivery kid sniffing around her. I watched them today. She likes him." Tommy could hear the dangerous edge creeping into Vinny's voice, the tone that usually preceded someone getting hurt. He had seen his boss make decisions based on emotion before, and they rarely ended well for anyone involved. "Boss, maybe you should just let this one go," Tommy said carefully. "Plenty of fish in the sea." Vinny's eyes flashed with an anger that Tommy recognized as a warning sign. "I don't let things go, Tommy. You know that. When I want something, I get it. And if you can't get it, then I make sure nobody else gets it either." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Tommy had been in this business long enough to know what that meant, and he also knew that once Vinny made up his mind about something, there was no talking him out of it. The next morning, Marcus woke up feeling better than he had in months. The conversation with Elena had replayed in his mind several times before he fell asleep, and he found himself looking forward to delivering her lunch again. For the first time since his parents' death, Marcus felt like someone actually saw him as more than just a function. He arrived at work early, helping the prep cooks get caught up from the previous day's backup. Russo's was a family business in the truest sense. Giovanni Russo had started the restaurant 40 years ago with recipes his mother had brought from Sicily, and now his son Danny ran the day-to-day operations, while Giovanni focused on the wine selection and charming the regular customers. Marcus had stumbled into the job 2 years ago when he was desperate for work, and the Russos had taken him in without asking too many questions about his background. They paid him fairly, treated him with respect, and Giovanni often insisted that Marcus join the family for dinner on slow Sunday evenings. "You seem happy today," Danny observed as Marcus loaded the lunch orders into his car. "Good date last night?" Marcus laughed, realizing how transparent his mood must be. "Just had a nice conversation with one of our regular customers yesterday, Dr. Vasquez at the hospital." Danny nodded approvingly. "Elena's a good woman. Fixed up my nephew after his motorcycle accident last year. Didn't charge us anything extra either." As Marcus drove toward the hospital, he didn't notice the black sedan following 3 cars behind him. Vinny had assigned 2 of his men to keep an eye on the delivery driver, wanting to know everything about this person who had somehow captured Elena's attention. The surveillance continued for 3 days. Marcus maintained his routine: work, home, occasional grocery shopping, and a weekly visit to his parents' graves. He lived a quiet, unremarkable life that would have been completely beneath Vinny's notice under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. Each day, Vinny's men reported the same thing. Marcus spent longer at the hospital than any of his other stops, and the doctor always seemed genuinely happy to see him. On Thursday, they even observed Elena walking Marcus to his car, something she had never done before. Elena had been thinking about Marcus more than she cared to admit. There was something about his quiet kindness that appealed to her. In her world of life and death decisions and high-stress situations, Marcus represented something simple and genuine. When he talked about his work, his modest apartment, or the books he liked to read, there was no pretense or hidden agenda. On Thursday, after Marcus delivered her lunch, Elena found herself walking him to his car. They stood in the hospital parking lot for 10 minutes, talking about a documentary they had both seen about ocean conservation. It was the kind of conversation Elena rarely had time for, and she realized she was reluctant to see it end. "Would you maybe like to get coffee sometime?" Marcus asked, the words coming out in a rush before he could lose his nerve. "I mean, when you're not working, if you have time." Elena hesitated for a moment, thinking about all the reasons she should say no. She worked 70-hour weeks, had student loans that required every spare dollar, and barely had time for a personal life. Getting involved with anyone, was probably not the smart choice right now. But Marcus was looking at her with such hopeful sincerity that Elena found herself nodding. "I'd like that," she said. "My schedule is crazy, but I could probably do Sunday afternoon." Marcus's smile was so bright that Elena couldn't help but smile back. They exchanged phone numbers, and Elena watched him drive away with a lightness in her step that she hadn't felt in months. From across the parking lot, Vinny's men captured the entire interaction with telephoto lenses. By that evening, Vinny was looking at photographs of Elena and Marcus laughing together, her hand briefly touching his arm. Both of them looking like people who were genuinely happy to be in each other's company. The jealousy that had been simmering in Vinny's chest for days finally boiled over. He had spent months trying to win Elena's attention, sending gifts, making donations, being charming and patient in ways that went against his nature. And this nobody, this delivery driver with nothing to offer, had accomplished in a few conversations what Vinny couldn't achieve with all his power and resources. That night, Vinny made the decision that would change everything. If Elena Vasquez wanted to waste her time with some loser instead of recognizing what a man like Vinny could offer her, then she needed to learn a lesson about the consequences of poor choices. "I want you to send a message to the delivery kid," Vinny told Tommy during their meeting that evening. "Nothing permanent, just something to help him understand that he should find a new job, maybe in another city." Tommy felt a familiar sinking feeling in his stomach. He had seen this pattern before. Vinny became obsessed with something, and when he couldn't have it, he destroyed anyone who stood in his way. "Boss, this is going to bring heat," Tommy warned. "The kid's not connected, not involved in anything. You start messing with civilians, especially ones with regular jobs and clean records, people notice." "Let them notice," Vinny said coldly. "I want everyone to understand that when Vincent Torino wants something, he gets it. And when someone gets in my way, there are consequences." "What about the doctor? You think she's going to be grateful when her boyfriend gets worked over?" Vinny's expression darkened. "She's going to learn that choices have consequences. Maybe next time she'll think twice before choosing the wrong man." Tommy knew there was no point in arguing further. When Vinny got this look in his eyes, this combination of wounded pride and cold fury, rational conversation became impossible. The best Tommy could hope for was to minimize the damage and try to keep his boss from doing something that would bring the federal investigators sniffing around their operation. But as Tommy left the meeting that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were crossing a line they had never crossed before. The Torino family had always operated by a certain code. They hurt people who hurt them first. They stayed in their lane. And they didn't involve civilians who weren't part of the game. What Vinny was planning violated all of those rules. And Tommy knew from experience that when you started breaking your own rules, it was usually the beginning of the end. Marcus had been looking forward to Sunday all week. He and Elena had arranged to meet at a small cafe near Lincoln Park, away from the hospital and the restaurant where they usually crossed paths. For the first time in years, Marcus felt like he had something to be excited about beyond just making it through another day. Sunday morning came with the first real hint of autumn in the air. Marcus showered, put on his best shirt, a blue button-down that he usually saved for special occasions, and drove to the cafe early. He found a table by the window and ordered coffee, watching the street outside and trying to calm the nervous energy that had been building since Thursday. Elena arrived right on time, looking different outside of her work environment. She wore jeans and a soft gray sweater, her hair down instead of pulled back in its usual professional style. When she smiled and waved through the window, Marcus felt his heart skip in a way that reminded him he was still capable of hope. They talked for 3 hours, about books they had read, places they wanted to travel, movies that had made them cry. Elena told Marcus about growing up in a house where her parents worked 2 jobs each just to keep food on the table, and how becoming a doctor had felt like climbing an impossible mountain, one small step at a time. Marcus shared stories about his parents. How his father had been a mechanic who could fix anything with an engine, and how his mother had taught high school English until the day she died. The conversation flowed so naturally that neither of them noticed when the lunch crowd came and went, or when the afternoon light began to shift toward evening. Elena found herself relaxing in a way she rarely did, laughing at Marcus's dry observations about his daily delivery routes and the characters he encountered. "You know," Elena said as they finally prepared to leave, "I was worried this might be awkward. Work relationships can get complicated." Marcus smiled. "Well, technically you're not my coworker. You're my customer who tips really well." "Is that all I am to you? A good tip?" Elena asked, pretending to be offended. "No," Marcus said, suddenly serious. "You're the first person in a long time who's made me feel like I exist." The honesty in his voice caught Elena off guard. She reached across the table and touched his hand, a gesture that felt both natural and significant. "You definitely exist," she said softly. They exchanged a brief kiss goodbye in the parking lot, nothing dramatic or passionate, just a gentle acknowledgement of the connection they had discovered. Elena drove home with music playing louder than usual, feeling lighter than she had in months. Marcus was halfway home when he noticed the black sedan in his rearview mirror. It had been behind him since he left the cafe, matching his speed and maintaining the same distance. When Marcus turned onto his street, the sedan continued straight, and Marcus dismissed it as coincidence. But the next morning, as Marcus loaded his car for the day's deliveries, 2 men approached him outside Russo's restaurant. They were both tall and broad-shouldered, wearing expensive suits that didn't quite hide the bulge of shoulder holsters. The older of the 2, a man with graying hair and cold eyes, spoke first. "Marcus Romano?" he asked, though it was clearly not a question. "Yes," Marcus replied, his heart beginning to race. He had seen enough movies to recognize muscle when it was standing in front of him. "My name is Carlo Benedetto. This is my associate, Frank. We'd like to have a conversation with you." Marcus looked around the parking lot, hoping to see Danny or one of the other restaurant employees, but it was early and the street was empty. What about? Get in the car, Carlos said, nodding toward a black Lincoln parked across the street. We'll take a ride, have a nice chat, and bring you right back. No problems. Marcus's mouth went dry. I don't think that's a good idea. Frank stepped closer, and Marcus could see a jagged scar running from his left ear to his jaw. It wasn't really a request, kid. The ride lasted 20 minutes, taking them through neighborhoods that became progressively more isolated. Carlo drove while Frank sat in the back seat behind Marcus, close enough that Marcus could smell his cologne and hear his steady breathing. They stopped in an empty parking lot behind a closed auto parts store. Carlo turned off the engine and twisted in his seat to face Marcus. Here's the thing, Carlo said conversationally. You've been spending time with someone who's already spoken for. Dr. Elena Vasquez. This is a problem. Marcus's mind raced. Spoken for by who? She never mentioned a boyfriend. Not a boyfriend, Frank said from the back seat. Someone much more important. Someone who doesn't like competition. I don't understand, Marcus said, though a cold understanding was beginning to form in his stomach. Elena and I just had coffee. We're friends. Carlo laughed, but there was no humor in it. Friends? That's sweet. But here's what you're going to do, kid. You're going to stop delivering food to that hospital. You're going to lose Dr. Vasquez's phone number. You're going to forget she exists. And if I don't? Frank leaned forward, and Marcus could feel his breath on the back of his neck. Then you're going to discover that sometimes accidents happen, people get hurt. Sometimes their friends get hurt too. The threat was clear enough that Marcus felt his hands start to shake. Who sent you? Someone who doesn't like to be disappointed, Carlos said. Someone who's being very generous by sending us to have this conversation instead of just solving the problem permanently. They drove Marcus back to the restaurant in silence. Before he got out of the car, Carlo grabbed his arm. Smart move would be to find a new job, Carlo said quietly. Maybe in another city. Fresh start, clean slate. Think about it. Marcus spent the rest of the day in a daze, going through the motions of his delivery route while his mind churned over the encounter. He knew enough about Chicago's underworld to understand that the men who had approached him were serious. These weren't random thugs making empty threats. They were professionals who worked for someone with real power, but the thought of simply disappearing from Elena's life, of never seeing her smile again or hearing her laugh, felt like a betrayal of everything he had started to hope for. For the first time in years, Marcus had found someone who made him want to be more than just invisible. When he arrived at the hospital for Elena's lunch delivery, Marcus hesitated in the parking lot. Carlo's warning echoed in his mind, but Elena's office window was visible from where he sat, and he could see her at her desk, probably wondering where her usual delivery was. Marcus made his decision. He grabbed Elena's lunch and walked into the hospital, knowing he was probably making a mistake but unable to bring himself to care. Elena looked up when he knocked on her office door, her face brightening in a way that made Marcus's chest tight with affection and fear. I was starting to worry you'd forgotten about me, she said, clearing space on her desk for the food container. Never, Marcus said, trying to keep his voice light. How's your day going? 3 surgeries before noon, but they all went well. Elena opened her lunch and inhaled appreciatively. I don't know what I'd do without these deliveries. They're the only predictable part of my day. Marcus wanted to tell her about the morning's encounter, about the men who had threatened him, and the unnamed person who apparently considered her property. But looking at Elena's tired face and thinking about all the real problems she dealt with every day, Marcus couldn't bring himself to add his troubles to her burden. Elena, he said carefully, are you involved with anyone? I mean, is there someone in your life who might not appreciate us spending time together? Elena looked puzzled. Like a boyfriend? No, I told you I don't really have time for relationships, Why? Just checking, Marcus said, forcing a smile. Sometimes people have complicated situations. They talked for a few more minutes, but Marcus found it difficult to concentrate. Every time a shadow passed by the office window, he expected to see Carlo or Frank. When Elena's pager went off, signaling another emergency, Marcus felt relieved to have an excuse to leave. "Are we still on for dinner Friday?" Elena asked as he gathered up the empty containers. They had made tentative plans during their Sunday coffee date. Marcus hesitated. Every rational part of his brain screamed at him to make an excuse, to cancel their plans and start creating distance before someone got hurt. But Elena was looking at him with such warmth and anticipation that Marcus found himself nodding. "Of course," he said. "I'm looking forward to it." That evening, Marcus lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his apartment, trying to figure out what to do. He could pack up his few belongings, leave Chicago, and start over somewhere else. It wouldn't be the first time he had lost everything and had to rebuild from nothing. But the thought of running felt like admitting defeat before he had even tried to fight. Marcus had spent the 5 years since his parents' death just surviving, getting through each day without any real purpose or hope. Elena had changed that, had made him remember what it felt like to want something more than just another paycheck. 2 days later, Marcus's world exploded. He was making his usual Wednesday morning deliveries when he got a call from Danny Russo. Danny's voice was tight with worry and anger. "Marcus, don't come back to the restaurant today," Danny said without preamble. "We had some visitors this morning, professional types. They made it clear that your employment here is terminated." Marcus pulled over to the side of the road, his hands shaking as he gripped the phone. "What kind of visitors?" "The kind that don't take no for an answer," Danny said grimly. "They said you'd understand. They also said if we tried to help you or hire you back, they'd burn the place down." Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the last vestiges of his normal life crumbling around him. "Danny, I'm sorry. I never meant for this to—" "Don't apologize to me," Danny interrupted. "Apologize to my father. He's been running this place for 40 years without any trouble, and now he's got to worry about some gangster deciding we're not cooperating enough." The line went dead. Marcus sat in his car on the side of busy Michigan Avenue, watching traffic flow past while his world fell apart. Without the delivery job, he had no income. Without income, he couldn't pay rent. And if he couldn't pay rent, he'd be homeless within a month. But worse than the financial implications was the realization that whoever was behind this had unlimited patience and resources. They weren't just threatening him, they were systematically destroying his ability to survive in Chicago. Marcus spent the afternoon driving aimlessly around the city, trying to think of options. He could go to the police, but what would he tell them? That some men had threatened him over a woman and now he'd lost his job? The police dealt with murders and robberies, not vague intimidation tactics that couldn't be proven. By evening, Marcus had made his decision. He drove to Elena's apartment building and waited in the parking lot until her shift ended. When she arrived home, looking exhausted after another long day, Marcus got out of his car and approached her. "Marcus?" Elena said, surprised to see him. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk," Marcus said. "It's important." Elena's apartment was small but comfortable, decorated with plants and books and photographs that made it feel like a real home. Marcus sat on her couch while Elena made coffee, trying to figure out how to explain a situation that sounded insane even to him. "I lost my job today," Marcus said when Elena sat down across from him. "Oh no," Elena said, immediately concerned. "What happened? Was it budget cuts?" "Not exactly." Marcus took a deep breath. "Someone wants me to stay away from you. They made that very clear, and when I didn't listen, they had me fired." Elena stared at him for a long moment. "Someone wants you to stay away from me? Who?" "I don't know his name," Marcus said. "But the men who approached me made it clear that he's not someone you refuse. They think you belong to him. That's ridiculous, Elena said, her voice rising. I don't belong to anyone, and I certainly haven't given anyone the impression that I'm unavailable. Marcus described his encounter with Carlo and Frank, watching Elena's expression shift from disbelief to understanding to anger. When he finished, Elena was quiet for several minutes, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug like she was trying to draw warmth from it. Vincent Torino, she said finally. You know him? Elena nodded slowly. He's been persistent. Flowers, gifts, donations to the hospital. I thought he was just a wealthy businessman with too much time on his hands. He's not a businessman, Marcus said quietly. Or at least, not the legitimate kind. I know what he is, Elena said, her voice hard. I grew up in this city. I know the stories. She looked at Marcus with a mixture of sadness and determination. I'm so sorry you got pulled into this. It's my fault. It's not your fault, Marcus said firmly. You didn't do anything wrong. I could have been clearer with him, Elena said. I could have told him explicitly that I wasn't interested instead of just being polite. Would it have mattered? Elena considered this. Probably not. Men like Vincent Torino don't hear no very often. They sat in silence for a while, both understanding the impossible situation they were facing. Marcus had no resources to fight someone like Torino, and Elena's career and safety were now at risk simply because she had chosen to spend time with the wrong person. What do we do? Elena asked finally. Marcus had been dreading this question because he knew there was only one rational answer. I leave, he said quietly. I pack up what I can fit in my car and drive until I'm far enough away that this stops being a problem for you. That's not fair, Elena said, and Marcus could hear tears in her voice. You shouldn't have to give up your whole life because some criminal thinks he owns me. Life isn't fair, Marcus said, though the words tasted bitter. Sometimes you have to choose between what's right and what's safe. Elena stood up and began pacing her small living room, her medical mind working through the problem like a diagnosis she couldn't quite make. There has to be another way, she said. We could go to the FBI. Organized crime is federal jurisdiction. And tell them what? That some guys threatened me and I got fired? That's not a federal case, Elena. That's barely a case at all. Then what about the media? Expose him? Marcus shook his head. Men like Torino have been dealing with media attention for decades. And even if we could prove he was behind this, what's the worst that happens to him? He pays a fine and gets angrier. Elena stopped pacing and looked at Marcus with an expression he couldn't quite read. What if we don't run? She said quietly. What do you mean? What if we stay and fight? What if we refuse to let him win? Marcus felt his heart race at the thought. Elena, these people don't play games. If we try to fight them and lose, then we lose, Elena said fiercely. But at least we lose on our own terms, making our own choices. That night, as Marcus lay on Elena's couch staring at the ceiling, he thought about his parents. His father had been the kind of man who never backed down from a fight, even when the odds were against him. His mother had taught him that sometimes doing the right thing meant doing the difficult thing. For 5 years, Marcus had been just surviving, just getting by. But now, for the first time since his parents' death, he had found something worth fighting for, someone worth fighting for. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable. Marcus wasn't going to run. He wasn't going to let Vincent Torino win by default. If Torino wanted a fight, Marcus would give him one. He just had to figure out how a delivery driver with no money and no connections could take on one of Chicago's most powerful crime families. The answer, when it came to him 3 days later, would change everything. The idea came to Marcus while he was walking through Grant Park on Saturday morning, his last day before his apartment rent was due with no job to pay it. He had been thinking about his father's garage, How his dad always said that the smallest wrench could move the biggest bolt if you applied leverage in exactly the right place. Vincent Torino was powerful because he operated in shadows, because his business dealings were hidden behind layers of legitimate fronts and legal protection. But what if someone turned on the lights? What if someone with nothing left to lose decided to make Torino's private business very public? Marcus spent the weekend at the Chicago Public Library, using their computers to research everything he could find about Vincent Torino and the family business. What he discovered was fascinating and terrifying in equal measure. The Torino family had their fingers in dozens of businesses across Chicago, construction companies that won city contracts despite higher bids, waste management firms that somehow always got the most profitable routes, restaurants and bars that never seemed to struggle despite poor reviews and empty dining rooms. All of it was technically legal, but the pattern was obvious to anyone who looked closely enough. More importantly, Marcus discovered that the FBI had been trying to build a case against the Torino family for years. They had several ongoing investigations, but they always seemed to fall apart when key witnesses developed sudden memory problems or decided to leave town unexpectedly. Marcus realized he had something the FBI had never had before: a victim who was willing to go on record, and a motivation that couldn't be bought or intimidated away. On Monday morning, Marcus walked into the Chicago FBI field office and asked to speak with someone about organized crime. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with skeptical eyes, looked him up and down and asked if he had an appointment. "No," Marcus said, "but I have information about Vincent Torino that might interest Agent Sarah Chen." Marcus had found Agent Chen's name in a newspaper article about organized crime prosecutions. She was described as a rising star in the FBI's organized crime unit, someone who had already put several mid-level criminals behind bars, despite being in her early 30s. 20 minutes later, Marcus was sitting in a small conference room across from Agent Chen and her partner, Agent David Rodriguez. Chen was younger than Marcus had expected, with short black hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of his appearance. "Mr. Romano," Agent Chen began, "you said you have information about Vincent Torino. What kind of information?" Marcus told them everything. About his relationship with Elena, about the threats from Carlo and Frank, about losing his job and the systematic intimidation campaign that was designed to force him out of Chicago. He spoke for 30 minutes without interruption, laying out the entire situation in chronological order. When he finished, Agent Rodriguez leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Romano, what you're describing is certainly concerning, but it's also difficult to prove. We'd need evidence beyond your word." "I understand that," Marcus said, "but I'm willing to help you get that evidence." Agent Chen raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I'm willing to wear a wire. I'm willing to try to provoke Torino or his associates into making threats that you can record. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to put this man away." The two agents exchanged glances. Agent Chen leaned forward, her expression serious. "Mr. Romano, you understand that what you're proposing is extremely dangerous. These people have killed witnesses before." "They're going to kill me anyway," Marcus said quietly. "At least this way. My death might accomplish something." Agent Rodriguez shook his head. "We can't ask a civilian to put himself at that kind of risk." "You're not asking," Marcus said. "I'm volunteering." The meeting lasted 2 more hours. Marcus answered dozens of questions about his interactions with Torino's men, about Elena, about his background and motivations. Finally, Agent Chen excused herself and Agent Rodriguez, leaving Marcus alone in the conference room for 15 minutes. When they returned, Agent Chen was carrying a thick file folder. "Mr. Romano, I'm going to show you something that doesn't leave this room." She opened the folder and spread out several photographs. "These are crime scene photos from the last 3 people who tried to testify against Vincent Torino." Marcus looked at the photos and felt his stomach lurch. The images were graphic and brutal, designed to send a clear message about what happened to people who crossed the Torino family. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Agent Chen asked. Marcus thought about Elena, about the fear in her eyes when he had told her about the threats. He thought about his parents, about the values they had tried to instill in him. He thought about spending the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, running from city to city whenever Vincent Torino decided he hadn't learned his lesson. "I'm sure," Marcus said. The plan they developed was elegant in its simplicity. Marcus would continue to pursue his relationship with Elena, deliberately provoking Torino's jealousy. When Torino's men inevitably escalated their threats, Marcus would be wearing recording equipment that would capture everything. The FBI would use the recordings to build a case for conspiracy, intimidation, and racketeering. It was dangerous, but it was also the best chance anyone had ever had to bring down Vincent Torino. The first test came 3 days later. Marcus had found a temporary job delivering newspapers in the early morning hours, and he used his afternoons to visit Elena at the hospital. On Thursday, as he was leaving the medical center, Carlo and Frank were waiting by his car. "Thought we had an understanding," Carlo said as Marcus approached. "I thought I made it clear that Dr. Vasquez and I are just friends," Marcus replied, his hand instinctively moving toward the recording device hidden in his jacket pocket. Frank stepped closer. "Funny thing about friends. Sometimes they have accidents. Sometimes their friends have accidents, too." "Is that a threat?" Marcus asked, speaking clearly for the benefit of the recording device. Carlo smiled coldly. "It's a prediction. You keep pushing and pretty soon someone's going to push back. Could be you. Could be the pretty doctor. Hard to say." "Vincent Torino sent you to make these threats?" For a moment, Carlo's composure slipped, and Marcus saw surprise flash across his face. "How do you know that name?" "I'm not stupid," Marcus said. "I know who you work for, and I know what he wants. But Elena doesn't belong to him, and neither do I." Frank grabbed Marcus by the shirt and slammed him against his car. "You mention that name again, and you're going to find out what happens to people who know too much." Marcus felt a spike of genuine fear, but he forced himself to keep talking. "Are you threatening to kill me on behalf of Vincent Torino?" Carlo pulled Frank back, but his eyes were furious. "Get out of Chicago, kid. Tonight. Don't come back." They walked away, leaving Marcus shaking beside his car. But when he checked the recording device later that evening, he found that every word had been captured clearly. Agent Chen was impressed when she heard the recording. "This is good," she said during their meeting the next day. "But we need more. We need them to be explicit about what they're threatening to do, and we need to connect it directly to Torino." The next escalation came sooner than expected. Marcus arrived at work on Monday morning to find his newspaper delivery truck vandalized. The tires were slashed, the windshield was shattered, and someone had spray-painted "Last Warning" across the side. But instead of being intimidated, Marcus felt energized. Each threat, each act of vandalism was another piece of evidence in the case against Vincent Torino. Marcus was no longer just a victim. He was an active participant in bringing down one of Chicago's most powerful criminals. Elena was less enthusiastic about the plan when Marcus finally told her about his cooperation with the FBI. They were having dinner at a small restaurant far from both the hospital and Marcus's neighborhood, and Elena's face went pale when Marcus explained what he was doing. "You're using yourself as bait," she said quietly. "You're deliberately provoking someone who has killed people." "I'm gathering evidence to put him in prison," Marcus corrected. "This is the only way to make it stop." "What if it doesn't work? What if he figures out what you're doing?" Marcus reached across the table and took her hand. "Then at least we tried. At least we fought back instead of just running away." Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring at their intertwined fingers. "I want to help," she said finally. Absolutely not, Marcus said immediately. You're already at risk just by being with me. I'm not going to let you. Let me? Elena interrupted, her eyes flashing. You don't get to decide what risks I take. This man has been harassing me for months, and now he's threatening people I care about. I have as much right to fight back as you do. Agent Chen was initially reluctant to involve Elena, but she eventually agreed to let the doctor participate in a limited capacity. Elena would continue her normal routine, but she would wear a recording device whenever she was at work in case Torino tried to approach her directly. The break they needed came 2 weeks later. Vincent Torino, frustrated by his men's inability to intimidate Marcus into leaving town, decided to take matters into his own hands. Marcus was walking out of the hospital after delivering Elena's lunch when he found Torino waiting by the entrance. The crime boss was impeccably dressed as always, but there was something different about him today. He looked older, more desperate, like a man who was running out of patience and options. "Marcus Romano," Torino said as Marcus approached. "We need to talk." Marcus's heart hammered in his chest, but he forced himself to appear calm. "About what, Mr. Torino?" Torino's eyes widened slightly at the use of his name. "You know who I am." "I know exactly who you are," Marcus said, speaking clearly for the recording device hidden in his jacket. "You're the man who's been having me threatened and intimidated because I'm dating a woman you think belongs to you." "Dr. Vasquez doesn't belong to me," Torino said carefully, "but she deserves better than some loser delivery driver who can't even keep a job." "Is that why you had me fired? To prove I was a loser?" Torino stepped closer, and Marcus could smell his expensive cologne. "I had you fired because you needed to learn your place, just like you need to learn that some women are out of your league. And if I don't learn that lesson?" For a moment, Torino's mask slipped, and Marcus saw the cold fury underneath. "Then you'll learn what happens to people who don't know when to quit." "Are you threatening me, Mr. Torino?" "I'm explaining reality," Torino said. "Elena Vasquez is going to be with me one way or another. You can walk away now and start over somewhere else. Or you can keep playing this game until someone gets hurt." "Someone like Elena?" Torino's smile was chilling. Accidents happen all the time in hospitals. Wrong medication, equipment failure, surgical complications. Would be a shame if a talented surgeon like Elena had her career ended by an unfortunate mistake. Marcus felt cold rage wash over him. "You're threatening to hurt Elena if I don't stay away from her." "I'm not threatening anyone," Torino said smoothly. "I'm just observing that Chicago can be a dangerous place for people who make enemies." The conversation lasted another 5 minutes, with Torino becoming increasingly explicit about what would happen to both Marcus and Elena if Marcus didn't disappear from their lives. By the time Torino walked away, Marcus had enough recorded evidence to put the crime boss away for decades. But Marcus's sense of triumph was short-lived. As he walked to his car, he noticed a familiar black sedan parked across the street. Carlo and Frank were watching him, and their expressions suggested that they knew exactly what had just happened. That evening, Marcus met with Agents Chen and Rodriguez at a safe house on the north side of the city. When they heard the recording of his conversation with Torino, both agents smiled for the first time since Marcus had known them. "This is it," Agent Chen said. "This is exactly what we need. Torino made specific threats against both you and Dr. Vasquez. We can arrest him tonight." But as they were planning the arrest operation, Marcus's phone rang. It was Elena, and her voice was shaking with fear. "Marcus, someone broke into my apartment," she said. "They didn't take anything, but they left a message. It says, 'Stop playing games or we'll stop them for you.'" Agent Chen grabbed the phone. "Dr. Vasquez, this is Agent Chen with the FBI. Are you hurt?" "No, but I'm scared," Elena said. "I think they know about the recording equipment." Agent Rodriguez was already on his radio, calling for backup units to be dispatched to Elena's address. "We need to move now," he told Agent Chen. If they know about the recordings, Romano and the doctor are both in immediate danger. The arrest operation that had been planned for the next morning was hastily moved to that evening. FBI agents surrounded Torino's restaurant while others moved to secure both Marcus and Elena in protective custody. But Vincent Torino had not survived 30 years in organized crime by being careless. By the time the FBI arrived at the restaurant, Torino was gone, along with most of his inner circle. Only a handful of low-level associates were arrested, and they all claimed to know nothing about any threats against Marcus or Elena. Marcus and Elena spent the next 3 days in a downtown hotel under FBI protection while agents searched for Torino. But the crime boss had vanished completely, along with Carlo, Frank, and several other key members of his organization. "He's probably halfway to a country without an extradition treaty by now," Agent Chen told Marcus on the 3rd day. "We'll keep looking, but men like Torino have escape plans that they've been developing for years." Marcus felt a crushing sense of defeat. After everything he had risked, after all the evidence they had gathered, Vincent Torino was free and would probably never face justice for his crimes. But Agent Rodriguez had different news when he arrived at the hotel that afternoon. "We got him," he announced, unable to suppress his excitement. "What do you mean?" Marcus asked. "Torino didn't run after all," Rodriguez explained. "He was hiding in a warehouse on the south side, planning to wait until the heat died down before resuming operations. But we got a tip from someone in his organization, someone who was tired of living in fear. It turned out that Tommy Marconi, Torino's longtime lieutenant and closest friend, had finally decided that his boss had gone too far. The threats against Elena, the escalating violence, and the violation of the family's traditional code had pushed Tommy beyond his breaking point. Tommy had called the FBI tip line and provided Torino's location in exchange for a plea deal that would allow him to avoid the death penalty for several murders he had committed over the years. Vincent Torino was arrested at 2 a.m. on a Thursday morning, found sleeping in a sleeping bag in the corner of a warehouse that smelled of motor oil and rust. When FBI agents kicked down the door, they found a man who looked nothing like the powerful crime boss who had terrorized Marcus and Elena just days earlier. The trial lasted 6 months. Marcus and Elena both testified about the threats and intimidation they had endured, and the recordings Marcus had made were played for the jury. Tommy Marconi testified about the inner workings of the Torino family, providing details about murders, extortion, and corruption that went back decades. Vincent Torino was convicted on 47 counts of racketeering, conspiracy, intimidation, and ordering the murders of 3 people who had tried to testify against him in previous cases. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the sentencing, Torino made eye contact with Marcus from across the courtroom. There was no anger in his expression, just a kind of tired recognition that he had been beaten by someone he had never taken seriously. After the trial, Marcus and Elena were free to resume their lives, but both had been changed by their experience. Marcus had discovered that he was capable of courage he never knew he possessed, that he could stand up to forces much more powerful than himself and win. Elena had learned that sometimes the most important battles were the ones that required you to risk everything you had worked for. Her willingness to fight alongside Marcus had deepened their relationship in ways that normal courtship never could have. Marcus used the reward money from the FBI to start his own small business, a courier service that specialized in medical deliveries. Within 2 years, he had expanded to employ 12 drivers and was contracting with hospitals throughout the Chicago area. Elena continued her work as a trauma surgeon, but she also began volunteering with organizations that helped witnesses in organized crime cases. Her experience had shown her how difficult it was for ordinary people to stand up to criminal organizations, and she wanted to help others find the courage to do what was right. 3 years after Vincent Torino's arrest, Marcus and Elena were married in a small ceremony at the Chicago Botanic Garden. Giovanni Russo, who had reopened his restaurant after Torino's conviction, catered the reception. Agent Chen and Agent Rodriguez both attended, along with Mrs. Antonelli from the bakery and dozens of other people whose lives had been touched by Marcus and Elena's story. During his wedding toast, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. 5 years earlier, he had been invisible, just another face in the crowd with no purpose beyond survival. The threats from Vincent Torino had forced him to choose between remaining invisible and fighting for something that mattered. "I learned that being invisible isn't always safe," Marcus told the wedding guests. "Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is try to disappear. Sometimes you have to step into the light, even when it's scary, even when you don't think you're strong enough." Elena squeezed his hand as he spoke, remembering those terrifying weeks when they had both faced the possibility of losing everything they cared about. The experience had taught her that love wasn't just about the happy moments. It was about finding someone willing to stand beside you when the world tried to tear you down. Vincent Torino died in federal prison 4 years later, killed by inmates who had learned about his crimes against women and children. The news of his death made the front page of the Chicago Tribune, but by then, Marcus and Elena had moved on with their lives. Marcus's courier service had grown into a successful company with offices in 3 states. Elena had been promoted to head of trauma surgery at Riverside Medical Center. They had bought a house in a quiet neighborhood where Elena could have the garden she had always wanted, and Marcus could restore classic cars in a garage that reminded him of his father's shop. But more importantly, they had proven to themselves and others that ordinary people could fight back against extraordinary evil and win. Their story became a case study at the FBI Academy, an example of how citizen cooperation could bring down criminal organizations that had seemed untouchable. Years later, when young FBI agents asked Agent Chen about the Torino case, she would tell them that the most powerful weapon against organized crime wasn't sophisticated surveillance technology or undercover operations. It was the willingness of regular people to risk their safety for the principle that no one should have to live in fear. Marcus Romano wasn't a hero when this started, Agent Chen would explain. He was just a delivery driver who fell in love with the wrong woman at the wrong time. But he chose to become a hero when it mattered most. That's the kind of courage that brings down empires. The delivery driver who had once been invisible had become unstoppable, not through violence or vengeance, but through the simple decision to stand up for what was right. And in doing so, he had discovered that the most powerful force in the world wasn't fear or intimidation or money. It was love worth fighting for.